Hey everybody, it's your old pal Chuck Dixon. So it must be Wednesday morning. And time for another Ask Chuck Dixon, episode 67, where you get to ask me questions about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Yeah, I'm amazed too. Uh, if you want to contact me directly to ask any questions, make a suggestion, or just get on the email list for cool new stuff, contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. That's brunobookstore@gmail.com. You can also ask questions here below the video or on Facebook or wherever, but the most direct route to reach me and often get a response is brunobookstore@gmail.com. First question is from Matthew Rasco. What are your thoughts on the Sharp novels and television show? The Sharp novels by Bernard Cornwell, if you're not familiar with them, are about a sort of ne'er-do-well, lower-class guy who is a officer. He becomes an officer even though he's a total commoner in the British Army during the Napoleonic era. Most specifically, he's a member of the 95th Rifles, which was a skirmisher battalion. And skirmishers back in the age of black powder warfare were the guys who would stand out in front. They were the first people to encounter the enemy. They were like pretty much like a special forces unit. And they would go out ahead of the main force. And in the case of a set to battle, they would actually be in front of the main firing lines to lay down suppression fire and discourage advancing troops. Anyway, getting a little technical here on the warfare angle, but these are great adventure stories, great tough guy, He-Man adventure stories, and Cornwell is a terrific writer in anything involving a period piece. He really does his homework, and he keeps the action flowing. These stories are compulsive page turners. They're pretty much the British equivalent of a Western, in that everything is resolved in the end through violence. There's lots of fights. There's lots of conflict within the group. There's lots of tension between Sharp and his fellow officers because, like I said, Sharp is a commoner. He's from the streets. He's from the gutter, and he's made an officer by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. He gets a battlefield commission. And back in those days, commoners just simply didn't become officers. All the officers were literally gentlemen of high birth who had paid for their commissions. Yeah, you could buy a lieutenancy, a captaincy in the British Army quite easily if you had enough cash and influence. Now, as far as the TV shows go, I like them. They're a lot of fun. The only pity is, except for the last two TV movies, are that the budgets are so low. But I credit the writers because they really do reduce the stories to westerns. you know, but when they get to their depiction of Waterloo, it's kind of pathetic. I mean, Waterloo was an engagement between actually three massive armies, numbering well over 100,000 men total, and in the Sharp's TV version, which is was shot for about $50 uh, in Ireland, you see at most 20 French soldiers at a time on screen. I'm sure everybody involved with the production was frustrated that they couldn't do a more epic portrayal, but if you want epic, check out the last two Sharp's TV adaptations, which were relocated. The stories were relocated to India, to the Raj. And they are pretty epic in scale because the budget went a lot further in India than it did in Ireland. And but they're fun. I've rewatched them a number of times. The casting is perfection, and it's nice to see Sean Bean live through a story. In fact, many stories. I forget how many of these are. They're all filmed as TV movies, and there's quite a few. And Bean is perfectly cast, as are everybody else in the cast. It's a they're a lot of fun. If you've never checked them out, either the TV show or the novels, I would suggest either or both. But yeah, I dig them. I dig them a lot. In fact, I approached Bernard Cornwell's people about doing graphic novel adaptations of these because they're just they would just be perfect for comic book treatment. And I thought, and I pressed this on the Cornwell people, that they would probably be international bestsellers. This kind of material sells well in Europe, and they'd certainly be welcome in Britain and Australia and Ireland and everywhere that the Sharp stories were popular. But sadly, I never heard back. I even had sample art done, which was quite excellent, and never heard back. Oh well, another day. Andrew Runyon, can you give us a few tried and true methods you use to come up with great ideas? Uh, well, ideas are only great in retrospect. I mean, I may come up with something I think is terrific, and either nobody gets it or more likely it wasn't that great an idea to begin with. Um, there's one tip I'll give you, and I call it the Kirby Principle. Jack Kirby came up with some absolutely ludicrous ideas uh, for comics, but he always made them work because he was earnest about it, and he put the sweat in. Take for example the Silver Surfer. This is a ridiculous character. He's a guy who rides a surfboard through space, outer space, and he's virtually indestructible, and he's nearly naked. And when I first saw the character on a cover of Fantastic Four, I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen in my life. By the time I was done reading the issue, he was my favorite character of all time. Well, for a while anyway. But I thought he was like the coolest character ever because Kirby sold me on him, because Kirby sold the character on himself first. So if you have an idea and it sounds kooky or wacky or unworkable, let it gestate a while. The craziest ideas are sometimes the best. And of course, they're the most different. And you got to take chances with ideas. Uh, you just got to put it out there if you have faith in it. And if you have enough faith and you present it with enough passion and enough earnestness, then you're going to get everyone else to believe in it too. And that's really what it's about, is making your idea believable, putting it into some sort of realistic context, even something as insane as the Silver Surfer. Because, Jack and Stan, we have to credit Stan here because he gave voice to the Silver Surfer. Um, they created this incredibly powerful character who's yet somehow vulnerable, somehow still a naif. I don't like what Stan did with Silver Surfer. He sort of wussified him when he did the run with John Buscema. He kind of took away the oomph, the machismo. He reduced the coolness factor of Silver Surfer. By, I think mostly by telling us too much about him. He was better off as a figure of mystery. But anyway, yeah, don't be afraid of your own ideas. Don't be afraid, like, oh, that's too crazy. I could never make that work. If you have the faith, you can make it work. So, and don't ever believe anybody says there's no new ideas, because there are. You know, in my opinion, the human mind is limitless. So there you go. Um, let's see, what's our next question here? Kevin Daniels. Self-published works seem to suffer from the lack of an experienced editor who genuinely loves comics and cares enough to troubleshoot plot lines, keep goal against mistakes like anachronisms, poor phrasing, etc., and generally cast a helpful, experienced eye over the story. New writers can pay or enlist their friends for services like proofreading, but where would they find professional and confidential advice in their storylines before they self-publish? So who will fulfill this role? I think plenty of new creators would want the guidance of veterans like yourself, but I guess that as writers, you prefer your time to be spent creatively on your own titles. Yeah, I have no interest in becoming a professional editor, but everybody needs an editor. Now, when I do comics work, I don't have editors anymore. I'm doing a lot of independently produced stuff, crowdfunded stuff, and the crowdfunding person, yeah, I suppose they're an editor, but for the most part, I'm self-editing. Um, and in the case of crowdfunding or collaborating with a publisher directly, there's a lot of back and forth on the project. and suggestions made and things like that. So, and I'm always flexible. Anybody who's ever worked with me will tell you that. I'm perfectly willing to rewrite something if the idea is good, and you need an editor. You need someone else to bounce the stuff off on. But if you're self-publishing, I don't think it's a good idea to hire an editor. Unless you're doing prose. Now I have an editor, Jay Manis. She's terrific, who edits my prose work, but she's not so much a story editor, though every once in a while she'll suggest something story wise, as she formats and checks for, uh, like you said, anachronisms, conflicts in the story, continuity errors, things like that. And she always corrects everything I write when I write about horses. She knows more about horses than I do, and riding, and she corrects all that stuff, which is great because I've been writing a lot of westerns and stuff. So, but you know, uh, that's the biggest downfall that I see. Um, it's not so much you need a story editor; you really need proofreaders, because both in prose and in comics, I see typos galore, and typos kill a story. They take you right out of it. So what you need is, you mentioned friends. You do need some friends, some nitpicky friends that are willing to look over your work. I'm fortunate that I've got Mike Hutchison, who is the nitpickiest nitpicker ever, and he goes over my prose books with a fine-tooth comb and finds every silly, dopey error I've made. Even if I've reread the thing 5 times, I miss them because I made the errors. So something in my mind made me make that error, and that same portion of the brain is perfectly willing to overlook it upon rereading. But Hutch doesn't overlook anything. So he finds them all. So yeah, and the more people that read it, the better. At CrossGen, we had no editors. There were no editors. But what we did have was a terrific review process. Before every issue went out to the printer, we printed up dummy copies, ashcan copies of the comic. And these were reviewed, not by one, not by two people, but by as many people as we could get in the room. First, it was reviewed by the team, and then it was reviewed by disinterested parties. I mean, I would sit in on reads of, Tony Bedard's books or Barbara Kiesel's books or Ron Mars's books, and then they would do the same for me. We would even bring in people from production. We would bring in artists and inkers and colorists and letterers from other books, just to take a look, just fresh set of eyes. So before that book went out to the printers, at least a dozen people had read it and read it together. Everyone read it together. So there was no slacking off. There was no like, oh, I'm going to skim this. No, you sat down and read the whole thing around the table with other people and exchanged ideas and spotted changes and all the rest of it. And I don't think we had a typo. I don't remember a typo ever in a CrossGen book because so many people read it with so many different pairs of eyes that it was caught. So the more people you can get to read your stuff, the better. The only problem is getting people to read your stuff. It is an imposition. It is an imposition. You're asking them to read it, to take their time and everything else. But, that's where good friends come in. So, and then, if you're working on a comic, you have a team. So there's a group of people working on the comic, supposedly. Um, at least 4 people maybe. And, they're going to read it. And they can have their relatives read it. Hey, mom, hey, sis, hey, bro, can you read my comic book and give me some pointers? So there you go. The more people that see it, the less you need an editor. So I wouldn't trust a freelance professional comic book editor as far as I could throw them anyway. Comics Gatekeeper. What did you think of the Airboy from 2014, the one with the meta elements of the comic writer meeting the fictional character? I was disappointed because James Robinson wrote this, and I was really looking forward, when I heard he was going to write Airboy, I was really looking forward to his portrayal of Airboy because he writes those Golden Age characters with such a great degree of earnestness and a fresh approach. But apparently he went for a sort of autobiographical, I hope not autobiographical. The writer in the story seems like a drunken drug-addled loser. I don't think that's James Robinson. Uh, so yeah, I don't know quite why he took that approach. I didn't really care for it. It was about as far from my approach to it as possible. My approach was very earnest, and James went the polar opposite. Yeah, I don't know what the point of it was. Maybe that's the only way he could get it approved, or maybe he just wanted to write a story like this and picked Airboy off of the public domain ash heap to use as his titular character. I don't know, but I'd like to see an earnest James Robinson Airboy. I'd like to have seen what he would have done with that. Levi Sweeney. What did you think of Batman Begins? It's personally my favorite out of the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, but it hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as its two sequels. Well, it made $1.5 billion. I think that's plenty of attention. I'm not I'm not any kind of Christopher Nolan fan. I think the guy is the most overrated director possibly ever. Um, and that's a pretty big crowd to top. There's a lot of overrated directors out there. I don't like his storytelling style, which is to not tell a story at all and basically save, uh, his bloated productions in the editing room. He basically films and films and films and films, and then sits in the editing room for months searching for a story. Yeah, I didn't like any of it uh, for the most part. There wasn't anything fun. It was so grim. I understand there are people that really like grim Batman, but to me, there's no relief. There's no contrast to the grimness. There's no humor, lightness, humanity, heart, honesty. There's nothing to compare the grimness to. It's just darker and darker and darker. And it's not, it's the Frank Miller approach to Batman. It's not my favorite. So what can I say? Uh, is it the best of the three films? I don't know. I found Dark Knight, the one with Joker, right? That's the one with Joker. Uh, the best of the three, mostly because it had the most cohesive storyline. They managed to find a decent story in the editing. The first film, I'm tired of origin stories, and the third film was a complete train wreck, in my opinion. Travis Murphy, having written comic adaptations of books before, could you tell us the process of translating prose to comic panels? How do you choose what to keep and what to cut? How do you adapt the narrative to the strengths of the comic medium without losing what made the original work special? Well, it's a labor. I mean, I'm currently adapting John Ringo's zombie epic, um, Black Tide Rising, into comic form, and it's challenging. Ringo has lots of great action scenes. There's lots of eye candy in the book, which makes my job a whole lot easier. But there's also a lot of technical, scientific stuff, which is all compelling when you read it in prose, but it's dead on the comic book page because it's yakety yakety yak pages, and it's guys sitting in a room, and it's death. So the biggest challenge for me was to get across that information, all the information the reader needed, in as compelling a way as possible without having 6 pages of people in a conference room. Um, and apparently Ringo and his people were happy with the end result of the first graphic novel. And but that's the challenge. And generally, when adapting a book, um, if I'm given the length, uh, you know, it's about 2 pages of prose to every comic book page. Now on Black Tide Rising, I had to leave a lot of stuff out. I had to cut a lot of segue scenes. He had an ensemble cast, and I understand as a novelist, you've got to keep revisiting that cast. You create beats with that cast, but a lot of them for me were useless. So I kind of concentrated my story on the two young girls in the story because that was the through story of the book. That's where the most suspense and interest lie. And they were new to this world of violence and everything else, and so we sort of explore this world through their eyes, and that's very much what John Ringo did in the novel. but he took departures to other characters, and that was eating up too much real estate in the comic book version, and I had to jettison a lot of it. So that's all part of it. You have to be very cruel. Speaking of cruel, I adapted The Hobbit with David Wenzel, and this was back in the 80s. And we didn't have much room at all. We had three prestige size books, three 48-page books in which to tell the story of The Hobbit, and it was nowhere near enough room to do the story justice. I had to trim a lot of stuff out to keep to the core story. And I mean, I had to cut Bjorn, who's my favorite Tolkien character. I had to cut him out. I mean, there was just simply no room to have him in the comic adaptation. And that's the other thing. I stuck to Tolkien's prose only. There is no, I didn't write any of the dialogue, any of the narration. It's all from Tolkien. I didn't make anything up. And that's what I generally try to do, because I'm not there to present my version of their book. I'm there to present a comic book version of their book. I am a total invisible hand here. And whether it's John Ringo or Tolkien or whoever it is I'm adapting, I stay as much to their prose as possible. Now, sometimes with more modern work, I'm a little freer to have a little bit of bridging dialogue or some descriptive or segue text that isn't in the novel because they didn't need it, but that I can throw in there. Now, some of these things are more challenging than others. I adapted a lot of Robert Jordan's books to comics, and they were very challenging because even though they're set in these wild fantasy worlds, there wasn't a lot of eye candy, and Jordan doesn't use action to pace his stories. He doesn't use action to propel his stories forward. A lot of plot development happens in rooms with people talking. For example, the very first book I adapted, New Spring, the first chapter is about two women watching two other women read a book. And there's no way to transport that into the comic book world and make it interesting. And there's a lot of internal stuff in these books, and it's nearly impossible to get across in comic book form. I did the best I could, and what I did was I latched onto any eye candy there was. I mean, if they talked about a battle that happened a generation before, and maybe somebody might mention it in 2 lines of dialogue, I showed the battle. I did a flashback. I mean, I didn't create new material. I was basing it on what Jordan wrote, but I sort of emphasized that flashback. So just to get a little oomph, a little, stabbing and fighting and fussing into the artwork so we could see stuff. I also gave a lot of attention to environment so we could see this world because, I figured that Robert Jordan's readers would like to see these graphic novel adaptations primarily because it was visualizing the world that Jordan created. And so, I was real big on describing, castles and fortifications and forests and mountains and all the rest of it, to give the artist grist so that they could, provide really terrific visuals for the comics because comics is a visual medium. But yeah, Jordan by far is the toughest adaptation I had to do because the stuff just was not, it was never written to be comics. It was written to be novels. Now, on the other hand, I adapted a lot of Vox Day's Throne of Bones, and Vox's stuff is eminently adaptable to the visual form. He goes into a lot of, he makes a lot of effort to create very vivid images in the reader's mind. And the only pity, again, in adapting Vox's stuff is I had to trim a lot of really terrific conversations. Vox's characters will get into these philosophical and theological exchanges that are really neat. They're fun to read and they're thought provoking, and they add a lot to the characters. But like I said, they're dead on the page. It's just yak, yak, yak. It's panel after panel of a couple of characters in a room or walking across a snowy courtyard, and it just doesn't work. But I would keep the gist of what the conversations were about because they're important to the work, but trim them so there was more room for, the kind of stuff you're seeing here. Plus his fantasy world. I mean, I'm not that big a fan of fantasy, but I do enjoy his stuff. Um, his fantasy world, a lot of it is set during like a Roman Imperium kind of thing, and that was a big draw for me. I love writing that stuff. So and I understand it. So there you go. That's adapting prose to comics. Every job's different. Every job has its challenges. I enjoy it. It's fun. I love this medium, and I love trying to draw in new readers by finding things that they might have enjoyed in prose and saying, hey, why don't you check out the comic? Why don't you check out this medium you've never checked out before? So there you go. Rick Garcia, if Bane Girl, what's her name? Vengeance? If Bane Girl takes off and is featured in movies, cartoons, etc., do you get a cut at all? Well, I assume that when Bane Girl appears, and this is not the way she appears in the comics, obviously a cosplayer. When Bane Girl appears in the comics, or in movies or TV or Lego or whatever, they're going to have to make reference to her dad, right? So that's how it breaks down in movies and TV. It's broken down into elements. So when you make a Batman movie, there's like 23 elements. And that includes, Bruce Wayne, Alfred, the Batcave, the Batmobile, Batarangs. Everything that's Batman is all added up. The villains, Commissioner Gordon, whatever. And it's all added up. And then the royalties are divvied out on that basis of how many elements were in the film. So I'm assuming that if they ever made God forbid, ever made a Batman movie that featured Bane's daughter, that they're going to have to show Bane at some point. So he would be one of the elements. And yeah, they would have to, by their own agreements, pay us. But, it's weird because it goes one way and not the other. I mean, you can create, a bat thing, bat whatever, you know, uh, and you don't get royalties because it's a version of Batman, you know. I mean, you could create a character like Bat Knight, you know, you could have, Bat Cat, whatever, as long as it's a variation of Batman, you don't get participation. Um, so I don't know how that works for a character like Bane, because this is Bane's daughter. Do the creators of Vengeance get anything? There's a question, because it's just a variation, or are they considering it a brand new character? It's an iffy thing. It's discussions with lawyers and licensing people and stuff like that. It's an argument that I had with them myself, because when they made Stephanie Brown Batgirl, they created a bunch of toys and stuff around Stephanie Brown as Batgirl, and I didn't see anything from that. Either I or Tom Lyle, the creator of Spoiler, the creator of Stephanie Brown, we didn't see anything. And their thing was that, well, it's Batgirl. And I said, no, it's a different version of Stephanie Brown. You use Stephanie Brown, you use her names on the packaging, you're using our character. We have participation in this character, both her secret identity and her costume identity. But that is an issue yet to be resolved, and probably never will be, quite frankly, because they've got lawyers hanging on hooks, waiting for guys like me to walk in. Scott Heilman. Hey, Scott Heilman. What movies have the 5 best action scenes? What 5 movies have the worst? What does a good action scene need? Does it differ from comics to prose to movies? Okay, I'll play, but I got 6 favorite action scenes. Now, we're not dividing these by chase, fight, whatever. I mean, an action scene can be almost anything. But, numero uno for me is the climax of The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah's epic, bloody Western, which is pretty much ends like a samurai movie where everybody dies. And I'm not spoiling anything. Everybody's going to die in the opening frames of this movie. But yeah, I mean, Peckinpah with his editing style and attention to detail and rhythmic pacing and everything else kind of set the standard for the action scene from this point on. he was the guy to beat. And if you watch modern action films today, they owe an awful lot to this movie. Now, going back a ways, there's a movie called Foreign Correspondent. It's an Alfred Hitchcock film starring Joel McCrea as a newspaper reporter who's in pre-war Europe, before the invasion of Poland, before the invasion of Holland, and before the war begins, basically. And he runs into all kinds of trouble. Well, I won't spoil this movie, but it ends with a spectacular, spectacular extended action sequence. And there's so much detail and so much heart and so much suspense and so much emotion in these final scenes. It's breathtaking. Even though this film was made in 1939, 1940, it still resonates today. This action scene kicks ass. And I won't spoil it. But for my money, that action scene was the first modern cinema action scene, even more than Fritz Lang's work in Germany was, because he did a lot of crazy action scenes too. But Hitchcock really creates an epic scale, multi-layered action scene that's common today. This kind of action scene is common today. But even though we've seen these kind of things over and over and over again, this one still moves you. This one still, makes your jaw drop for the intensity and everything else. Hitchcock really was a master. If you ever get to check it out, Foreign Correspondent. I'm probably spoiling it by saying it ends on such a spectacular action scene, but it will not disappoint. Another movie that ends on a spectacular action scene is Sword of Doom. It's a samurai flick from the early 60s. Nakadai is the star, and he plays a samurai, a Ronin samurai, a loner, who is suffering through a curse, or at least he believes so, of his sword. His sword possesses him and makes him kill. And the end of this movie was probably a big inspiration to Sam Peckinpah and the Wild Bunch, because the ending of this movie is apocalyptic. It's him against everybody, and I mean everybody. At one point, you're led to believe that characters he killed early in the film have come back for him. And there's this fight through a large Japanese paper walled house that has to be seen to be believed. It's beautifully edited, beautifully paced, and just violent as all get out. It's a good thing the movie was in black and white, because it would have been almost disturbing to watch the amount of bloodletting at the end of this film. But you really need to check it out. It's called Sword of Doom, and it is even more than Kurosawa, probably my favorite samurai movie ever, just because of its sheer raw intensity. Now, a little more lighthearted on the fight scenes. In First Strike, Jackie Chan's ladder fight. He takes a folding ladder and just beats the living daylights out of everybody when he isn't pinching his own fingers. And it's a great action scene because of that. Most of us have handled an aluminum ladder. They're bulky, they're cumbersome, and they will pinch your fingers if you're not careful. And here's Jackie with one. He's not wielding some obscure martial arts weapon that none of us are familiar with. He's not leaping from rooftop to rooftop. He's just taking this ladder and he's just using it as a flail, using it as a shield. I mean, you got to see this scene. It's spectacularly filmed. And nobody but Jackie would have thought of it. Nobody but Jackie could have pulled it off. Now, gun battles. As far as gun battles, the best gun battle and most realistic, I've had both military guys and cops agree with me on this one wholeheartedly. There's a film called Mystery Road, stars Aaron Peterson, who's a terrific action star from Australia. And it's a movie called Mystery Road, and he plays a police detective, and he's out in the outback. I mean, he is way out in the middle of freaking nowhere. There is nothing all the way to the horizon line. But toward the end of the film, is a climactic gun battle. And some of it's long distance, some of it's close up, and it is hair-raising. And it's methodically shot. It's deliberately paced. The suspense is excruciating, and like I said, a lot of people who know this stuff firsthand have told me or agreed with me this is the best firefight ever put on film. Most realistic firefight ever put on film. You need to check it out. Now for number 6, because we're going to go to excess, the corridor of light sequence in Evil Dead Retribution. I go back and watch this over and over and over again. And yeah, it's a crazy Evil Dead movie, but the background, the the pacing, the editing, the athleticism of the people involved, the rising action, the rising suspense, and the level. The Evil Dead movies, I mean, I enjoy them as popcorn flicks. They don't usually rise to a level of emotion, but there's an emotional intensity in this scene that's absent in a lot of action films today, and a real sense of even though Alice, played by Mila Jovovich, is nearly superhuman, there's still a sense that she might not make it to the other end of this hall alive because of the rising threat. But it's just a a sort of artsy fight scene, but still has all the goodies that a good fight scene should have, and I dig it. Now, there's lots of other action scenes. I could go on and on and on. I mean, we didn't even get to chases because there's so many of them. So maybe in a future episode, I'll run down the 5 best chases and maybe the 5 best firefights. I don't know. I'm not a big list fan, but Scott, for you, anything. Now, as far as 5 bad action scenes, there's too many bad action scenes in movies to count. But one sticks out above all. In The Manchurian Candidate, Frank Sinatra has a karate fight, and I'm using air quotes, karate fight, with, I believe it was Henry Silva. I can't remember who it was with. And at the time, when Manchurian Candidate was released in the early 60s, it was groundbreaking. Everybody talked about this great karate fight that Frank Sinatra has in this movie. And you watch it now and it's pathetic. I mean, it is sad. It's just, you don't buy it for a minute. It's just a really bad, really poorly staged, clumsily done. And here it's John Frankenheimer, director. He's directed some tremendous action scenes. But, this one sucks, quite frankly. It's a very disappointing scene in an otherwise excellent movie. And, we wouldn't, we would have to wait until From Russia with Love, the fight inside the train car between Sean Connery and Robert Shaw, to have the close quarters martial arts battle, uh, redeemed for us cinemaphiles. But it's miserable. And my other main complaint about modern films and action movies is they go too far. You look at a franchise like Fast and Furious, which isn't the only one to do this, but it's the most painful. A decent popcorn movie franchise. I really enjoyed all of these movies up until number 5. Up to number 5. With number 6 on, they move into the realm of superheroes. The producers probably said, hey, these superhero movies are great. Let's treat our characters as if they're totally invincible, totally invulnerable to pain and injury, and just nutty, insane, crazy, physically impossible things intrude on what is basically a hot rod chase franchise. And like I said, Fast and Furious isn't the only franchise guilty of this. The last Star Trek movie was insane. I mean, there were so many scenes in the climax of that film where the characters simply would have been splattered into street pizzas, but somehow end up landing intact and ready to fight. There's lots of other movies that do the same thing where characters take an insane amount of beating, punishment, you know, mortal physical damage, and they get up and they're still running around. In the next scene we see a couple of bandages on their face that indicate that they might have gotten hurt. From incidences that obviously they would have lost limbs or been crushed to a pulp. But until this crazy superhero cycle ends, and I predict it will, we're kind of stuck with this level of gonzo action. I mean, I'm all for gonzo action, but let's have a little bit of realism so that we can all relate to it. Now, as far as writing action scenes for comics and prose, you want to have, comics and prose are obviously different. Prose, I find that if you have the action happen sudden, quickly, with the minimum amount of description. That seems best. But like comics and like film and like any other medium that portrays action, you want your action to have heart. You want to care about the participants. You want to care about the outcome. When the good guy and the bad guy finally meet, you know, you need stakes. You need a rising threat. You need all of these things so that you give a damn how it turns out in the end. You give a damn about who wins. Another thing is interesting locales. I point to Jackie Chan films. Jackie Chan always makes sure his fights just don't take place in some abandoned warehouse. It's always in an interesting place with lots of, possibilities for collateral damage, or places that are dangerous in themselves, fighting on top of rooftops or fighting inside of a room that's flooding, or, whatever. So there's an outside threat. The environment itself is hostile, and interesting, and that to me makes for a good scene, action scene, and surprises, reversals, anything you can do to make your action scene different, um, and you know like I said, I used in an earlier video the example of from a Korean film called Pirates, in which there's this great chase fight scene, but it's really accentuated by the presence of a giant mill wheel that's rolling through the town, crushing everything in sight, and they intermittently cut back to that. So you're always aware there's this background tension. So you don't want to just have two guys slugging it out. You want to have a lot more going on in the scene, either in the background or an underground tension. And like I said, then there has to be heart. There has to be an emotionality to the scene. The conclusion of the fight scene has to matter. If the good guy loses, all is lost. You know, and you know so there's just a lot to think about, and you can't just cast them aside. A lot of times in comics, I see the action is like an interruption to the story. It's like a musical number in the middle of an Abbott Costello movie. It doesn't carry the story. It interrupts the story. you know and I think too many modern comic book writers or postmodern comic book writers look upon the action scene as eh. But you have to think of it more like a Broadway play. In a Broadway play, the music and dance numbers carry the story. They're essential to the plot. They're not just, hey, let's stop and sing and dance for a while. No, they carry the story. They either provide emotional depth or literally move the plot forward through song and dance. They're not dead wood um, to the story. So you have to think of your action scenes like that as well. A lot of people write plot advancement, action, plot advancement, action, plot advancement, action. I write plot advancement all the time. The characters are talking in a room or beating each other's brains out on a rooftop. I'm moving the plot forward every single time. So every page moves that plot forward. And action is essential. It's essential to comics because it's a visual medium. We read these things to see the story as well as read the story. And so you've got to pay attention to those action scenes. They are integral. And like I say, rule of thumb, I have at least 3 action scenes in any story. And that doesn't mean 3 fights or 3 conflicts. An action scene can be, Batman and Robin swinging across rooftops, in a rainstorm or whatever. But things are moving, things are happening. There's a suspense. He's swinging across a rooftop on a rope. That's suspenseful because most of us would fall off. Batman and Robin aren't, but still, it's cool. It's something interesting that's happening that you can see. It's action. R.B. Probst. Chuck, can you give us the skinny on Nightwing, the Target one shot? Were you planning to have Dick make more appearances as Target only for those plans to fall through? I enjoyed the one shot and thought the character design was cool and would have loved to see Dick pull out that costume again. Yeah, this was a prestige format one shot. I think it's 48 pages. It was by me and Scott McDaniel, the amazing Scott McDaniel, who not only did the first, I think, 42 issues of Nightwing without missing an issue. He drew his own inventory issues. He drew Nightwing 1/2. He drew Nightwing 1,000,000. He drew Nightwing 0. He did this prestige thing. He did a new story in Nightwing Secret Origins. Often The only thing I was sad about, he didn't get to do the annuals. I mean, that's the only thing he didn't get to do during his run. Everything Nightwing was by Scott McDaniel for the, you know, three or more years that he was on the title. And that's pretty astounding. Now, the target happened after our original editors had left, and I contacted everybody because I wasn't real sure when this came out. And when this question was asked, I couldn't remember why we did this. I knew there was an editorial reason, but I couldn't. And I'm not going to solve the mystery for you here either. I'm sorry. But for some reason, they wanted to get Nightwing out of costume and put him in this Target costume. And I contacted my original editor, Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson said that happened after I left. Asked Darren Vincenzo. I asked Darren Vincenzo. He said that happened just after I left. I don't know why they did it, and I'm not in contact with any of the editors from the period, post Denny O'Neil. So I can't tell you why we did this, but I remember there was a reason, and it could be something as simple as there was room on the publishing schedule and they wanted to put something in there, and Scott McDaniel, had a few days free. So, and I was always ready to write some more Nightwing. So that may have been it. And more often than you will believe, I was the go-to guy when they would go, "Hey, this project fell through, but we've got a hole in the publishing schedule. We've got, you know, if we don't have something for the printer, we're gonna have to pay anyway. So we need something to," and that's how comics were created, to keep the presses running. And at the pulp paper companies. So at the pulp publishers, they invented comics because they had downtime on their printers. Those printers had to move 24 hours a day or they weren't paying for themselves. There's a little secret how comics are created as an afterthought. But yeah, they would say, well, Chuck, there's room on the schedule for a 4-issue mini, or there's room on the schedule for a 48-pager, or there's room on the schedule for an 80-page giant. Do you have any ideas? And I would, always come up with, I never disappointed, when it was my core characters, Nightwing, Birds of Prey, Batman, and all the rest. Nightwing the Target may very well have been one of those. It was a fun story to write. It was fun. Hey, have you checked out ArcToons? ArcToons is a free digital comics website. We've got dozens and dozens of series running now. And by the time you see this video, we're going to have almost 3 months worth of material, 3 months worth of weekly episodes of these different series that we're working on. I'm doing a lot of work here in a bunch of different genres, and some genres I've never worked in before. So it's fascinating work for me. And you should check it out. Like I said, it's free, it's high res, and maybe by the time you're hearing this, it'll even be a phone app, because I know they're working very hard right now to turn this into a phone app so you can read these comics on your phone. Some of them are specifically created for this format. Some are adapted from previous work I did for Archaven. But it's all cool stuff, and it's high res. You can read it anywhere, even on your TV screen in your living room. And if you check it out and if you like it, would you consider going to Patreon and joining the support team for Archaven ArcToons? It would be Patreon Archaven. It's the Chuck Dixon Slush Fund. Any money contributed here, you can subscribe $1, $3, $5, and there's some goodies on the $3 and $5 level if you subscribe. You can subscribe, toss a few bucks to it. It helps me pay the starving artists. This account is only for my projects at ArcToons, and it's how I finance these. It's how I pay the artists, and maybe even someday pay myself. So if you like what you see on ArcToons, man, a buck a month would go a long way. If you just throw a few bucks our way, we can keep this going and provide you with brand new weekly comic book entertainment. Hey, that's it for me for this week. Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for liking. Thanks for your questions. I appreciate it all. And I'll see everybody down the road.